A Vampire Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Where Numbers Lie. The inventory spreadsheet had been wrong for 3 weeks before Haven noticed. It wasn't the kind of error that screamed. It whispered. Just a discrepancy in the late-night logs. Numbers that didn't align with what should have been there. O-negative units. CMV-negative blood. Both marked as withdrawn in the system. Both missing from the refrigerated units. The disparity was small enough that it might have escaped notice during the day shift, when the blood bank buzzed with activity and cross-checks and the controlled chaos of a functioning hospital. But Haven worked nights. She worked the hours when the facility quieted to a hum and the blood bank became hers alone. She sat at her desk in the small temperature-controlled room, surrounded by the gentle whir of refrigeration units and the glow of her computer monitor. The hospital's digital inventory system was supposed to be foolproof. Every withdrawal logged, every signature required, every unit accounted for. Yet 3 weeks of meticulous documentation revealed something the system had missed. Someone was taking blood. Not in ways that triggered alarms. Not in quantities massive enough to set off immediate alerts. But methodically. Specifically. Only certain blood types on specific nights. Haven's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced certainty. She'd worked in blood banks for 9 years now, since she was 23 years old. Most people didn't understand what that meant. The responsibility, the weight of knowing that the bags in these refrigerators represented someone's second chance at life. A child in surgery, a mother hemorrhaging during childbirth, an accident victim racing against the clock. She'd seen the desperate gratitude in families' eyes when blood arrived in time. She'd also seen the opposite. She opened her notebook, physical paper, handwritten records separate from the hospital's electronic systems. She did this for every discrepancy she found, a practice her mentor Harold had taught her years ago when she'd first started in the blood bank. Trust your instincts, he'd told her. Numbers don't lie, but systems sometimes do. Keep your own records. Always. Haven began mapping the pattern with meticulous precision. O-negative appeared to be the priority. Rarer, universal donor. Valuable in crisis situations. But the CMV-negative selections were the real puzzle. That specificity meant medical knowledge. Precision. Clinical understanding. Someone in this hospital knew exactly what they were looking for, and they knew why they were looking for it. Haven's sister Eleanor had needed blood once. 8 years ago. During what should have been routine surgery. An appendix rupture that turned into something far more sinister. Infection. Complications. Sepsis. The blood bank had been low during that particular emergency. A donation drive had been canceled due to a winter storm. And by the time emergency supplies were requisitioned from the regional bank, by the time everything aligned, Eleanor was already slipping away. Haven had been 17, sitting in a waiting room painted an institutional beige, watching her older sister fight a losing battle in a hospital bed, while machines beeped their useless rhythm. She'd memorized the blood types mentioned in whispered conversations between doctors. Some units arrived too late, some never arrived at all. One of the physicians had mentioned something about O-negative being especially critical in Eleanor's case. Haven didn't understand the full medical details then. She understood them now. The hospital had issued an apology afterward, along with a settlement that felt like hush money. A system failure, they'd said. A temporary shortage. An unfortunate convergence of circumstances. Haven had kept the letter in a drawer in her apartment for years before finally throwing it away. The words meant nothing. Eleanor was still dead. No apology could change that. But that loss had crystallized something in Haven. A purpose so sharp it cut through everything else. She'd left high school and gone straight into medical training, eventually specializing in blood bank services. Not to fix what was broken, exactly. But to make sure nobody else's sister died, because blood went missing. She pulled up the security footage from the previous evening. 2:47 a.m. according to the timestamp. The camera angle showed the blood bank entrance, the secured door that required keycard access. She watched the footage at normal speed, then slower, then frame by frame. The door opened at 2:53 a.m. A figure in a dark suit, pale skin luminous against the darkness of the hallway. He moved with an unhurried certainty, someone unaccustomed to questioning his right to be anywhere he wished to be. Haven recognized him from the hospital's administrative materials. Matthias Venn, Chief Executive Officer. One of those executives who existed more as a name on letterhead than an actual human presence in the hospital's daily operations. Except here he was, accessing the blood bank during the hours when nobody was scheduled to be here. He remained inside for exactly 4 minutes. His movements were fluid, efficient. He didn't hesitate or search. He knew exactly where to go. When he left, a box was tucked under his arm. Haven's hands moved without conscious direction, documenting the timestamp, the date, saving the footage frame to her secure drive. She expanded the magnification on the monitor, trying to get a clearer image of his face, though she already knew who he was. There was something unusual about his features. Sharp cheekbones, a kind of ageless quality that was difficult to pin down. She'd seen him once before in person, at a hospital fundraiser that Harold had dragged her to. He'd barely acknowledged the room full of staff, had stood to the side observing rather than engaging. She remembered thinking he seemed tired, in the way that no amount of sleep could fix. She checked her logs from that night. 7 units of O-negative, 3 units of CMV-negative, all withdrawn at 2:54 a.m. The units were documented as being used for a procedure in the intensive care unit. Haven had called the ICU the next morning, carefully phrasing her question as a routine verification. The ICU supervisor had seemed confused. No procedures matching that blood requisition had occurred. The units never left the blood bank. Haven worked backward through weeks of footage. Matthias appeared on the recorded nights corresponding with the missing units. Never the same time twice. Always between 2 and 4 a.m., always carrying the box away. She'd reviewed 40 hours of footage over several days, watching him move through her domain with the casual ownership of someone who didn't expect to be questioned. The pattern was unmistakable. The specificity of blood types was no accident. O-negative and CMV-negative together suggested a medical emergency of significant proportions. Someone was requesting these exact types for a reason. Clinical knowledge suggesting knowledge of specific blood conditions or immune statuses, but nobody at the hospital was being treated for anything requiring this particular combination. She'd checked patient records, surgical schedules, emergency logs. Nothing matched. Haven looked at her personal calendar. 3 weeks was the length of time she'd documented with certainty, but her instinct said this had been happening longer. The early discrepancies had been small enough to escape notice, easy enough to write off as human error or system glitches. She'd only begun her detailed cross-referencing after she'd happened to notice the pattern in the first place. A conversation overheard between 2 day shift nurses about unusual blood bank requests that seemed to come from above and never resulted in documented procedures. She needed someone to verify what she was seeing, someone with authority and clearance. Someone who could provide her with additional access and wouldn't immediately report her investigation to administration without discussion. Someone she could trust. Haven picked up her phone and sent a text to Harold. Harold Kessler had been her mentor since her first day in this blood bank. He was 58 years old, approaching retirement, the kind of man who'd seen enough hospital failures and bureaucratic compromises to understand when someone was genuinely concerned versus paranoid. He'd been the one to call her 3 years ago when irregularities had been discovered in another department. He'd been the one to encourage her to document everything. Need to discuss blood bank discrepancies. "Can you meet me before my shift tomorrow?" she typed. The response came within minutes. What kind of discrepancies? She'd answered dozens of his clarifying questions over the years, when she'd flagged procedural concerns. He'd always believed her, always listened, always taken her seriously. "I found something," she texted back. "Want your perspective before I escalate. Coffee at the break room? 10 p.m.? Perfect." Haven deleted the text thread automatically. It was a habit. Careful, maybe paranoid, but necessary when you worked in healthcare, where everything was documented, tracked, monitored, every call logged, every text potentially subject to review. Better to be cautious with sensitive matters. She turned back to her computer screen and resumed the footage playback, watching the executive move through her domain with that same casual ownership. The box he carried was small enough to fit under an arm, large enough to hold something valuable, large enough to hold multiple units of blood, 3 weeks of missing blood, a pattern she was only now beginning to understand. And somewhere in the question of why, somewhere in the specificity of blood types and the midnight visits, Haven suspected she'd find answers about things far more complicated than simple theft. The blood bank hummed around her, refrigeration units maintaining their steady temperature. The inventory system stored its official numbers, clean and correct and fundamentally dishonest. The night shift stretched ahead of her, just hours remaining before the day staff arrived, and the facility transformed back into something public and observable. Haven made a decision that would change everything. She would document this thoroughly, carefully, with the precision that had defined her entire career since the day her sister died from a hospital's failure to provide adequate blood. She would find out what Matthias Venn was doing. She would understand why, and she would make sure it couldn't happen to anyone else. She opened a new document on her secure drive and began typing, creating a comprehensive timeline of every missing unit, every security footage frame, every discrepancy. The work was methodical and calm. It was the work of someone who had learned long ago that vigilance was the only protection against loss. The blood hummed around her in the darkness. Chapter 2. The Watching Game. Matthias Venn sat in his office on the 32nd floor, watching the city lights blur into a tapestry of gold and shadow. The office was minimalist by design, expensive, but deliberately sparse. No photographs, no personal touches. Nothing that suggested a human inhabited this space rather than a CEO functioning as a corporate machine. James's phone call had come through an hour ago. Tense, apologetic. Haven had been asking questions about Matthias's background, his access protocols, his reasons for being in the blood bank during night hours. She'd texted Harold directly, requesting a meeting. She was being careful, James had noted. Professional. But she was digging. Matthias had listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled against the desk. When James finished, Matthias had simply said, "Thank you for the notification," and ended the call. The problem wasn't that she'd been asking questions. Hospital staff asked questions constantly about administrative irregularities, inventory discrepancies, procedural anomalies. The problem was that Haven was intelligent, methodical. She worked in blood services, which meant she understood medical protocols, understood what specific blood types suggested, understood the implications of deliberate selection patterns. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Most people would have accepted the system's official explanations and moved on with their lives. Haven had instead compiled physical documentation, cross-referenced security footage, and traced a pattern backward to its source. 3 weeks. She'd caught the discrepancies in 3 weeks. Matthias stood and moved to the window. Outside, the city pulsed with nighttime energy. Somewhere in this sprawling urban landscape, vampires were dying. The blood plague had begun in Romania 6 months ago, a viral mutation that attacked the undead physiology in ways human medicine couldn't explain. It moved through vampire populations like wildfire, destroying the cellular regeneration that made vampires functionally immortal. The infected experienced deterioration, organs failing, senses dulling, the agony of watching your own body turn against itself. There was no cure. The only treatment was clean blood, uncontaminated blood, blood taken from humans who carried no trace of the virus. The regional vampire network had been quietly acquiring blood through underground channels, but supplies were insufficient. Thousands of vampires were at risk across the eastern seaboard. And now a blood bank nurse in their primary hospital was close to understanding why their CEO was stealing blood intended for human patients. He picked up his phone and texted Cassian. "My office. Midnight." Cassian arrived exactly on time, moving through the hallway with that characteristic silence that came with centuries of practice. He was tall like his father, pale like his father, but his eyes held a calculating coldness that even Matthias's ancient gaze didn't possess. Cassian had been born into vampire society during the height of European aristocracy. He'd learned early that survival meant strategic thinking. "We have a problem," Matthias said without preamble. He outlined Haven's investigation, the documentation she'd compiled, the trajectory of her questions. Cassian listened, processing, his expression remaining neutral. "She's intelligent," Cassian observed. "She'll understand the blood type implications eventually." Which is why we need to know everything about her, Matthias said. Every conversation, every research avenue, every connection she has within this hospital. We need to understand her threat level completely before she understands us. Cassian was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Technical surveillance, full spectrum. I'll coordinate with Evelyn. Do it carefully. I want her investigated, not exposed. The surveillance began the following evening. Evelyn worked quietly through her IT contacts in the hospital's infrastructure division. The IT supervisor owed her favors. Several of them, accumulated over years of carefully managed leverage. When Evelyn requested access to Haven's hospital email communications for administrative audit purposes, the supervisor didn't question it. When she asked about accessing phone records for calls made on the hospital switchboard from Haven's extension, the request was filed and processed. Cassian handled the physical surveillance component personally. He visited Haven's apartment building on a Tuesday morning, dressed in maintenance coveralls. The building superintendent had been compelled 3 years ago. A vampire's gift of suggestion that had worn like comfortable clothing. The superintendent let Cassian into Haven's apartment without hesitation. The space told Cassian everything he needed to know. Haven was methodical. She had a small desk in the bedroom covered with printed documents, hospital policies, blood bank procedures, administrative emails. She had a wall calendar where she'd marked the nights corresponding with missing blood units. She kept a journal, handwritten, documenting her observations and conclusions. Cassian photographed every page with a small device before replacing everything exactly as it had been. Mini cameras were placed in 2 locations. One in Haven's locker at the hospital, one in her car. Cassian used devices so small they were virtually undetectable, designed specifically for surveillance operations where discovery would be catastrophic. Harold contacted Haven on Wednesday morning. Coffee meeting confirmed for 10 p.m. before her shift. Cassian monitored the hospital switchboard communication, listened to their brief exchange. Haven was careful with what she said in a recorded environment. Smart. That evening, Cassian sat in a parked car outside the hospital, observing Haven's movements through the security camera feeds that Evelyn had piped directly to his encrypted phone. Haven entered through the main entrance at 9:45 p.m., her research materials in a folder she clutched against her chest. Her heartbeat would be elevated. Cassian could hear it through the ambient microphone he'd managed to activate in her car. Fear mixed with determination. She didn't know she was being watched. She didn't know that every electronic footprint she created was being monitored, cataloged, analyzed. She didn't know that a vampire executive and his network had already begun constructing a defense. Over the course of 5 days, Cassian compiled a comprehensive profile. Haven had no romantic relationship. No family connections besides a deceased sister from 8 years ago, a loss that seemed to drive every decision she'd made since. She spent her free time either researching medical databases or confiding in Harold Kessler, the only person in the hospital system she genuinely trusted. The photographs from Haven's apartment journal were particularly revealing. She'd connected blood type specificity to known medical emergencies. She'd researched CMV-negative blood requirements. She'd even downloaded articles about rare blood conditions and exotic viral infections. She was dangerously close to understanding. Another week, perhaps 2, and she'd begin asking questions that touched on the vampire world directly. Matthias received Cassian's briefing in his office on Friday night. The documentation was thorough. Haven's investigation pattern, her research methodologies, the emotional trauma that motivated her obsessive pursuit of the truth, her absolute trust in Harold, her isolation from everyone else in the hospital. She's a threat, Cassian concluded, but she's a manageable threat. Her credibility could be questioned. Her investigation could be redirected. Matthias was quiet for a long moment. The blood plague continued to kill. Every day without adequate blood supply meant vampire deaths across the region. The network's desperation was reaching critical levels. They couldn't afford to allow human discovery of their operation, but eliminating Haven would create complications of its own. A missing blood bank nurse would trigger investigations. Her documentation would eventually surface. Her death would become a liability. We don't eliminate her, Matthias said finally. We misdirect her investigation, point her toward a legitimate criminal instead. Cassian understood immediately. David Salazar, the technician. We plant evidence. Create a digital trail. Make it look like he's been logging unauthorized access during the nights when blood disappears. Falsify his badge entry records. Make him the obvious suspect when her investigation inevitably reaches hospital security. Cassian nodded, already calculating the technical requirements. It'll take 2 days to establish the pattern convincingly. His badge data needs to be altered carefully. Nothing that obvious digital forensics would catch, but credible enough to survive initial investigation. Do it, Matthias said, and continue monitoring Haven's research. If she begins connecting details we haven't anticipated, I want to know immediately. The misdirection was elegant in its simplicity. While Haven continued her investigation, believing she was uncovering a mystery, Cassian systematically constructed false evidence that would point her investigation toward an innocent technician. By the time she discovered that David was innocent, if she discovered that, the real operation would have evolved beyond her ability to detect. The blood plague continued to ravage the vampire population, and in the blood bank, Haven methodically documented evidence that would soon lead her directly into the path of a false solution. A dead end constructed by forces she didn't yet understand were watching. Matthias returned to his window, observing the city lights. Somewhere out there, vampires were dying. Somewhere below him, Haven was working her night shift, researching her pattern, moving closer to a truth she wouldn't reach because he'd already changed the game she was playing. He thought briefly about what would happen when she finally discovered the extent of the deception, when she realized she'd been observed, monitored, manipulated. The thought generated no guilt, just acknowledgement of necessity. In his 615 years of existence, Matthias had learned that survival often required making decisions that looked like cruelty from the perspective of those too limited to understand the broader context. Haven would eventually understand, or she wouldn't. Either way, the blood plague took precedence. Chapter 3. The Perfect Frame. Haven's hands trembled as she scrolled through David Salazar's badge access records. The data was damning, clear, undeniable on the surface. David's keycard had been used to enter the blood bank on 7 separate nights, the same nights when blood units disappeared. The timestamps matched perfectly. Too perfectly. Haven had pulled up the hospital's digital archive, comparing her manual documentation to the official security system logs. David's badge showed access at 2:47 a.m. on Thursday, at 2:53 a.m. on the following Tuesday, at 3:15 a.m. on the night after that. It was the kind of pattern that would convince anyone. Haven almost believed it herself. Almost. But something nagged at her with an intensity she couldn't fully articulate. She'd spent 9 years working in blood services, understanding patterns, understanding how real criminal activity typically unfolded. Criminals were sloppy. They made mistakes. They left inconsistencies that betrayed their actions. The access logs she was looking at were too clean, too methodical, too perfectly aligned with her investigation timeline. She'd decided to confront David directly. Better to verify before escalating. Better to understand his explanation before involving security protocols that couldn't be easily reversed if she was wrong. David worked day shift in the blood bank processing division. Haven found him in the laboratory section on Wednesday morning, preparing blood samples for compatibility testing. He was 29 years old, thin, nervous, the kind of person who made eye contact and maintained professionalism despite the obvious anxiety that seemed to accompany his every interaction with supervisory staff. When Haven pulled him aside, David's face went pale. "Your badge has been flagged in our security investigation," Haven said carefully, keeping her tone neutral. "There are access records showing you entered the blood bank during night hours on specific dates. I need you to explain those entries." David's response was immediate panic. His hands shook, his voice cracked. He insisted he'd never accessed the blood bank during night shifts. He worked day shift exclusively. He never came to the hospital at night. The access records had to be wrong. His badge must have been compromised somehow. Haven pulled out her phone and showed him the timestamps. David's confusion deepened into genuine terror. "I wasn't here," he insisted. "My boyfriend can verify. I've been home every night. We live together. I haven't been anywhere near the hospital after my shift ends." She verified the alibi before the day was finished. David's boyfriend provided confirmations for each suspicious night. Text messages, phone records. They'd been home together, watching shows, cooking dinner, sleeping. The boyfriend was adamant. David hadn't left the apartment. Haven sat in her car in the hospital parking lot that evening, staring at her own documentation. The evidence against David was perfect. Flawless. Too flawless. She'd reviewed enough security footage to recognize the difference between genuine criminal behavior and something constructed. Real criminals made mistakes. Real digital manipulation by someone with actual security clearance was often clumsy, leaving traces of modification that forensic specialists could eventually detect. But this looked like someone had built David's guilt from the ground up, with the kind of access and technical expertise that suggested knowledge of exactly how hospital security systems functioned. Haven drove to her apartment that evening with growing paranoia. She entered slowly, carefully, examining everything. Her research materials on the desk. She'd left them stacked in a specific order, papers overlapping at particular angles. Now they were arranged differently. Not dramatically different. Subtle. But different enough that she noticed. Different enough that confirmed her worst suspicion. Someone had been in her space while she was working. She moved through the apartment systematically, documenting her observations. Her journal, the handwritten notes about Eleanor, about the blood pattern investigation. Had someone photographed these? The pages looked slightly worn in ways they hadn't before. Her laptop. She checked the login history. 2 entries she didn't recognize, both at times when she'd been sleeping. Technical access that had left digital footprints despite attempts to cover them. Someone was watching her. Someone with enough access to plant false evidence against an innocent hospital employee. Enough resources to monitor her communications. Enough authority to move through her private space without consequence. Haven's next shift felt surreal. She performed her duties mechanically, checking blood inventories, verifying storage conditions, documenting routine procedures. Everything remained normal on the surface. But now she was hyper-aware of her surroundings, scrutinizing every interaction, every glance from passing staff. She texted Harold requesting an earlier meeting. Need to talk. Something's wrong with the investigation. Harold agreed to coffee at 9 p.m. instead of their originally scheduled 10 p.m. meeting. When Haven arrived at the hospital break room, she found him waiting with an odd formality she'd never seen from him before. His posture was stiff. His smile was forced. He kept glancing toward the door as if concerned about being observed. "Haven," he began carefully, "I've been thinking about your investigation. I believe you should step back from it." The suggestion was so contrary to everything Harold had taught her over the years that it took her several seconds to process his words. "What?" she asked. "Step back," Harold repeated, his voice tense. "Leave it to proper channels. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for the discrepancies. Continuing your investigation could create complications." Haven studied his face. Harold was a poor liar. His anxiety was visible in the tension around his eyes, in the careful way he was choosing his words. He wasn't speaking from personal conviction. He was speaking from instruction. "What happened?" Haven asked quietly. "Who told you to say this?" Harold looked away. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For a long moment, he said nothing. "James contacted me," Harold finally admitted. His voice was lower now, more genuine. "He said my mentoring you had created a conflict of interest. He suggested that I encourage you to stop your investigation. For your own safety," he said. "For my own safety?" Haven's pulse accelerated. "Harold, what does that mean?" "Haven, there are things—" Harold paused, choosing his words with obvious care. "There are things in this hospital that aren't what they appear to be. Powerful things, complicated things. People in positions of authority who don't take kindly to scrutiny. Like the CEO," Haven pressed. "Matthias Venn?" Harold's face went pale. His eyes darted around the break room as if checking for observers. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Matthias personally spoke with James about your questions," Harold said. "He asked about your investigation specifically. He wanted to know what you'd discovered, what evidence you'd compiled, who you'd confided in." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Haven gripped the edge of the table. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows I've been investigating him." "Yes," Harold said. "And he's already taken steps to make sure your investigation reaches a particular conclusion. A conclusion that doesn't implicate him." Haven felt cold despite the warm temperature of the break room. She thought about the perfect evidence against David. The planted access logs, the too clean digital trail. She thought about her apartment being accessed, her research photographed, her communications being monitored. She thought about power, about how someone with enough authority in a hospital could reshape reality with documentation and digital records and careful manipulation of the truth. "What do I do?" she asked Harold, though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to hear the answer. Harold looked truly anguished. "I don't know, Haven. I genuinely don't know." But Haven was beginning to understand that she'd stepped into territory far more dangerous than she'd initially realized. She wasn't just investigating a theft anymore. She was investigating someone with the power to watch her, frame innocent people, and make reality conform to whatever narrative he constructed. And now that she was aware she was being watched, the real question wasn't whether she should continue investigating. The real question was whether she had any choice at all. Chapter 4. The Truth Behind Closed Doors. Matthias's summons arrived through James at 10:47 p.m. Haven was to report to the executive offices immediately. Her shift supervisor looked uncomfortable delivering the message, as if merely relaying the instruction made her complicit in something darker. The 32nd floor was empty. The hallway stretched in both directions, fluorescent lights casting everything in institutional white. Matthias's office door was unmarked, distinguished only by the fact that it existed at the end of a private corridor accessible only to executive staff. Haven's keycard granted her access. Evelyn had ensured that beforehand. The office was nothing like she expected. No mahogany desk or leather furniture. No symbols of status or power carefully arranged to intimidate visitors. Instead, the space was austere. Minimal. The walls held no artwork. The desk contained no personal items. A single window overlooked the city below, the view reduced to abstract patterns of light and shadow. The room felt designed for someone who didn't want to be remembered. Matthias stood by the window when she entered, his silver hair catching the distant glow of city lights. He didn't turn immediately. When he finally faced her, Haven understood why she'd initially found something unsettling about his features. His eyes held a quality that no amount of sleep deprivation could explain. They were ancient. Not in the sense of appearing aged. His face was young, unlined, immaculate, but the eyes themselves seemed to contain centuries of observation, assessment, judgment. "Close the door," he said simply. Haven obeyed, acutely aware that she just removed herself from any public space, any surveillance, any protection that a hallway might theoretically provide. "Your investigation has been thorough," Matthias continued, still not looking at her directly. "Methodical. You've demonstrated the kind of intelligence and attention to detail that typically leads to promotions within hospital administration. Instead, it's leading you toward information that will either transform your life or end it." Haven's mouth was dry. She forced herself to speak. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm being honest," Matthias said. He turned fully to face her now. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that seemed to contain no warmth. "I've spent 615 years learning that honesty is less common than threats, and therefore more valuable. You deserve honesty before you understand what's happening." Haven wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. 615 years. The number hung in the air between them, so impossible that it seemed to warp reality around itself. "You're stealing blood," Haven said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You're taking O-negative and CMV-negative units from the hospital inventory. You've been doing it for months. I have documentation." "Yes," Matthias agreed. "All of that is accurate." His immediate confession seemed designed to destabilize her. Haven had prepared responses to denials, explanations to counter lies. She hadn't prepared for simple agreement. "Why?" Haven demanded. Matthias moved to his desk and sat down. He gestured for her to do the same. Haven remained standing. "There's a condition affecting the vampire population across this region," Matthias said calmly. "A viral plague that attacks undead physiology. It's lethal. There's no cure." The only treatment is clean blood. Blood from humans carrying no trace of the infection. I've been acquiring blood from this hospital because it's the safest, most reliable source in the region. The words should have sounded insane. They did sound insane. But Matthias delivered them with the kind of certainty that made skepticism seem foolish. Vampire? Haven heard herself ask. You're claiming to be... A vampire, yes. Specifically, the Vampire King. The one who commands all other vampires in existence. I've held this position for 247 years. Before that, I was simply an ancient member of the underground community. I turned at age 32 in 1410. The year was significant because it was during a particularly interesting period of human history, but that's contextually irrelevant. Haven sat down. Her legs had stopped supporting her weight. The blood plague is killing my people, Matthias continued. Thousands of vampires across the eastern seaboard. Without adequate blood supply, the infected experience deterioration that even our regenerative abilities can't repair. They die slowly, painfully. I've taken blood from this hospital because the alternative is watching an entire civilization collapse while human authorities remain blissfully unaware of what exists in the shadows of their world. So you've been framing an innocent technician, Haven said, her voice shaking with something between anger and shock. You've been watching me, breaking into my apartment, stealing my research, all of this to cover up theft. I've been protecting you, Matthias corrected, and protecting my people. The technician will survive this. He'll be cleared when the investigation reaches its predetermined conclusion. You, however, represent a different category of problem. He stood and moved around his desk, positioning himself between Haven and the office door. You know too much. You're intelligent enough to piece together implications that most humans would miss. You're connected to someone, Harold Kessler, who now also carries sensitive information. And you've demonstrated through your investigation that you're willing to pursue truth regardless of personal consequence. That combination makes you either a valuable asset or a critical liability. What are you saying? Haven whispered. I'm saying that I'm offering you sanctuary, Matthias said. Ancient law, older than your country's founding. Humans who witness supernatural secrets and choose to protect them receive legal status within vampire courts. You would become a liaison between my organization and this hospital. You would maintain your position here, continue your work, but with complete awareness of what you're actually facilitating. In exchange for your silence and cooperation, I guarantee your protection. No vampire court can touch you. No agent of the supernatural world can harm you. You become untouchable. And if I refuse? Haven asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Then I eliminate you, Matthias said, his tone remaining factual, clinical. I would do it regretfully. You're exceptional at your work, but I can't allow someone with your intelligence to remain a loose end when you're this close to exposing operations that took centuries to establish. Haven felt tears forming, but she refused to let them fall. That's not a choice. That's coercion. Yes, Matthias acknowledged. It is. I'm not pretending otherwise. I'm 615 years old. I've learned that morality and survival rarely align. I'm choosing survival. My people's survival. Haven stood abruptly. I need time. I need to think about this. You can have 72 hours. Matthias interrupted. But you'll spend them here, in the hospital, under observation. James will arrange for you to be admitted to a private room under medical observation guise. You'll tell your colleagues that you've fallen ill. You won't contact anyone outside this facility. You won't attempt to access the internet or your phone. You'll remain confined while you make this decision. And Evelyn? Haven asked, understanding now why the security chief was suddenly everywhere in the hospital. We'll be stationed outside your room, Matthias confirmed. Not as a threat, but as a courtesy, to ensure other vampire operatives understand the boundaries of your new status, whatever you decide. Haven's mind was racing through possibilities, calculating odds, searching for escape routes that probably didn't exist. She was trapped. Not physically yet, but the boundaries were collapsing around her. Why tell me any of this? Haven asked. Why not just eliminate me and dispose of my research? Matthias regarded her for a long moment. Because you loved your sister. Harold mentioned that while he was convincing me not to kill you immediately. Eleanor, dead 8 years because of a hospital's failure to provide adequate blood supply. I've been alive for over 600 years. I've learned to recognize when human motivation rises to the level of genuine principle, rather than simple self-interest. Your investigation wasn't driven by ambition or curiosity. It was driven by grief, by loyalty, by the desire to prevent others from experiencing the loss you survived. He paused. Those are the only human values I still respect. If I agree to sanctuary, will you stop the blood thefts? Haven asked. Will you use legitimate channels? Eventually, Matthias said. Once the blood plague stabilizes, once the regional vampire population returns to stable numbers, blood acquisition through legitimate channels will become possible again. But not yet. Not while my people are dying. Haven felt the trap tightening, but also something else. The recognition that Matthias was telling her the truth as he understood it. A vampire king choosing to be honest rather than simply erasing a problem. She was going to say yes. Not because she wanted to. Not because she believed sanctuary was protection, rather than another form of imprisonment, but because she understood that survival sometimes required accepting terrible choices. I need those 72 hours, Haven said quietly. Then you'll have them. Matthias agreed. He moved to his office door and opened it. Evelyn stood in the hallway, waiting. Arrange her admission to a private medical observation room. Ensure her comfort, but ensure also that she understands the boundaries of her confinement. As Evelyn led her away, Haven caught her reflection in the office window. She looked like a different person already. Someone trapped. Someone who'd stepped through a door and found it locked behind her. The 72 hours of confinement had begun. Chapter 5. The exposure begins. The medical observation room was smaller than Haven had anticipated. A single bed, a monitor displaying her vitals, a window that looked out onto the hospital's interior courtyard rather than the city below. Evelyn remained stationed outside the door, visible through the small reinforced glass window. Not threatening, just present. A reminder that confinement wasn't negotiable. 36 hours into her 72-hour deadline, Haven sat on the hospital bed and tried to understand how her life had compressed into this impossible space. She'd been allowed 1 meal per shift. No visitors. No external communication. The television mounted to the wall played daytime programming on mute. Her phone had been confiscated. The room had no internet access. The isolation was deliberate. Time to think. Time to process. Time to come to terms with the fact that her choice was between 2 forms of death: physical elimination or the living death of sanctuary, bound to silence for eternity. On the morning of the second full day of confinement, Harold arrived at her door with Evelyn's permission. His visit was technically unauthorized, but the security chief appeared to welcome his presence. Harold entered the room looking older than Haven remembered, his face etched with something between guilt and desperate concern. I've contacted someone, Harold said quietly, keeping his voice low despite the soundproofed walls. A detective, Owen Graves. He's worked the hospital corruption cases before. He has authority to investigate financial crimes at the administrative level. Haven's pulse accelerated. What did you tell him? Everything, Harold said. About your investigation. About the blood discrepancies. About David being framed. About your confinement here. About Matthias. I told him that the hospital CEO was somehow involved in covering up a major crime, and that an innocent employee had been sacrificed to conceal it. You risked everything, Haven whispered. I didn't invoke any sanctuary, Harold corrected. I simply gave information to law enforcement. Sanctuary applies to vampires. Law enforcement is human. Different legal systems entirely. He paused. Haven, I couldn't let this continue. Not with you trapped in this room. Not with David facing potential charges for crimes he didn't commit. Not with whoever is really responsible walking free. Evelyn appeared at the window. She gestured for Harold to leave. He squeezed Haven's hand briefly before departing, but the gesture communicated something essential. He'd put his own safety at risk by contacting Owen. 18 hours later, the hospital was flooded with law enforcement. Haven heard the chaos from her confined room. Raised voices in the hallway, security being questioned, systems being accessed by federal investigators. The FBI had arrived, conducting a full audit of blood bank procedures and administrative oversight. Matthias had gone to ground. No appearance in the hospital. No communication through intermediaries. The Vampire King had simply disappeared, which meant the situation was significantly more complicated than a simple investigation into embezzlement. Owen appeared at her door that afternoon, a detective badge worn casually on a lanyard over his shirt. He was tall, with brown hair and skeptical eyes. He looked at her with the exhaustion of someone who'd been awake for too long. "I'm Detective Owen Graves. I need to take your statement regarding blood inventory discrepancies at this hospital. Are you willing to speak with me?" Haven glanced at Evelyn, who remained positioned outside the door. The security chief gave no indication of whether Haven should cooperate. That absence of instruction felt like its own kind of message. "Yes," Haven said. "I'll speak with you." Owen arranged for them to meet in the hospital cafeteria. Neutral territory. Public space. Haven was released from her observation room for the first time in 40 hours. Her legs felt unstable. The hallways seemed too bright. Every person they passed felt like a potential threat. The cafeteria was mostly empty at midday. They sat at a corner table, away from the few staff members grabbing quick meals between shifts. Owen placed a small recorder between them. "Tell me about your investigation," he said. Haven did, carefully. She outlined the blood type patterns, the access anomalies showing CEO presence during thefts, the timeline correlations. She provided her handwritten documentation, the physical records she'd compiled. She explained how she'd discovered the evidence pointing toward David and why she'd determined it was false. What she didn't mention was vampires. What she didn't mention was sanctuary law. What she didn't mention was the confrontation in the executive office. She focused instead on the administrative irregularities, the CEO's suspicious access, the deliberate misdirection against an innocent employee. "This is solid work," Owen said, reviewing her timeline. "Thorough. You have evidence of administrative misconduct at minimum, possibly theft if blood is being used outside the hospital system." He paused. "But you're leaving something out. You're afraid of something." Haven met his gaze. She wanted to tell him. The words were forming in her throat. But then she felt it. The memory of Matthias's threat pressing on her like a hand over her mouth. If she said what she knew, she wouldn't survive long enough to finish the sentence. "I'm afraid of losing my job," she said instead. And it wasn't entirely a lie. "I'm afraid of retaliation. I'm afraid of the scope of what I don't understand." Owen nodded slowly. "Understandable. But I need to tell you something. While you were confined, we started a deeper investigation. We discovered that Regina Holloway, the hospital administrator, has been systematically embezzling blood inventory for black market medical distribution. 6 months of falsified records, thousands of units unaccounted for. The financial trail alone is substantial enough for federal prosecution." Haven's mind reeled. Regina. Not Matthias. The embezzlement was real, independent from the vampire thefts, which meant Matthias hadn't simply orchestrated Regina's involvement. Her involvement was authentic, providing perfect cover for his own operations. "But here's what's interesting," Owen continued. "Someone anonymously sent us detailed evidence of Regina's scheme. Digital forensics, transaction records, the works. It came through an encrypted server, untraceable. Someone inside the hospital administration wanted us to find her. And when we found her, we found that David Salazar's access records had been falsified to misdirect investigation." "David is innocent," Haven said. "Completely," Owen confirmed. "We're exonerating him publicly. The falsified records will be attributed to Regina's attempts to conceal her own involvement." He studied Haven carefully. "But that raises a question. Who falsified David's records? And why? Why frame an innocent technician?" "To misdirect investigation," Haven said. "To point you toward an obvious suspect so you wouldn't look deeper." "Exactly. Which means whoever wanted to conceal the real blood thefts knew that framing someone would work temporarily. But they also had sufficient access to hospital systems to manipulate records. That level of technical capability and administrative privilege suggests someone at the executive level. Owen leaned back. Someone like your CEO. Haven felt the pressure of his ultimatum tighten in her chest. She couldn't confirm his suspicions, couldn't elaborate, couldn't do anything except exist in this impossible space where she knew the truth, but was magically compelled to silence. I need to return to my room, Haven said finally. I'm not feeling well. Of course, Owen said. He didn't push. Thank you for the statement. You've helped us significantly. Haven was escorted back to her medical observation room by Evelyn. The security chief's expression remained neutral. But as she closed the door, Evelyn said quietly, Matthias appreciates your discretion. The FBI remained at the hospital for 5 days. Regina was arrested. Her embezzlement was documented. David's innocence was publicly confirmed. The blood theft case was officially closed, attributed entirely to Regina's black market operation for personal profit. The real blood thefts were never mentioned again. On the evening of Haven's release from medical observation, Matthias's office sent a message requesting her presence at the administrative level. The 72-hour deadline had passed. Time for her answer. But Haven already knew what she was going to say. Chapter 6. The Council's Judgment. The underground sanctum existed beneath the hospital's foundation level, accessible through passages that predated the building's construction by over a century. Haven had never known such spaces existed until Evelyn escorted her down through sealed corridors and reinforced doorways. The air grew colder as they descended, carrying a mineral scent that suggested bedrock and stone worn smooth by centuries of passage. The sanctum itself was vast, cathedral-like, the kind of space designed for gatherings of significance. Stone walls rose toward a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. Torches burned along the perimeter, casting flickering light across carved archways and raised platforms. Approximately 40 vampires occupied the chamber, representing different regional courts. Haven recognized the formal structure immediately. This was governance. This was power consolidated and distributed among competing factions. Matthias stood at the center on an elevated dais. His silver hair caught the torchlight, creating an almost ethereal quality. His expression remained neutral, but Haven could sense the tension radiating through his entire frame. Cassian stood nearby, his similar coloring marking him as clearly connected to the Vampire King, though his expression was far more guarded than his father's. An older vampire stepped forward from the assembled gathering. She was tall, dark-skinned, with eyes that held centuries of accumulated authority. Her voice carried effortlessly through the sanctum, without raising in volume. The sanctuary law invocation is highly irregular, the elder stated. This human possesses knowledge of our blood plague operation. She has been interviewed by human law enforcement. She represents an uncontrolled exposure risk. The sanctuary law predates our current organizational structure, Matthias responded, his tone measured. It was established specifically to address situations where humans inadvertently discover vampire operations. Haven Sinclair has documented evidence of blood theft. She has communicated portions of that investigation to Detective Owen Graves. She remains a liability in the human legal system, as well as a potential security threat to vampire interests. A younger vampire, male, with aggressive posture, stood abruptly. The solution is simple. Eliminate her. Make the human investigator disappear. Frame the disappearance as unrelated to any vampire activity. And her investigation documentation? Matthias asked calmly. Her handwritten records already exist in multiple locations. Her testimony has already been provided to law enforcement. Eliminating her now merely confirms that something beyond standard criminal investigation is occurring. Cassian stepped forward. My father invoked sanctuary law with full knowledge of the legal implications. This law exists precisely because humans sometimes discover our existence through circumstance rather than intention. Haven Sinclair's investigation was motivated by legitimate professional concerns regarding blood inventory discrepancies. She stumbled onto vampire operations through competence, not through deliberate investigation of the supernatural. Sanctuary requires human consent, the female elder stated. The law is explicit on this point. The human must willingly accept the binding. We cannot force sanctuary upon her without violating the legal framework itself. Correct, Matthias acknowledged. Which is why I am invoking my authority as Vampire King. I am extraordinary granting sanctuary status to Haven Sinclair, regardless of her explicit consent. This action sets legal precedent, but it is within my authority to establish precedent when vampire survival is at stake. Shocked silence rippled through the sanctum. Vampires didn't grant each other surprised reactions easily. Their faces were trained to stillness through centuries of practice. But this moment seemed to crack that discipline. The elderly vampire's eyes widened slightly. You understand what you're proposing? That a vampire king can unilaterally impose sanctuary upon a human without her consent? This rewrites fundamental legal protections. I understand completely, Matthias said, and I accept full personal liability for Haven Sinclair's compliance with sanctuary protocols. If she violates the binding, if she reveals vampire existence to anyone outside this immediate network, I personally authorize her execution. Not a vampire court. Not a council vote. My personal execution of a human I have bound under sanctuary law. Cassian's expression shifted. Haven caught the moment his father's words penetrated fully. Matthias had just imprisoned himself as thoroughly as he'd imprisoned Haven. He'd become personally responsible for enforcing her silence, which meant he'd become personally invested in her cooperation. This is unprecedented, another vampire stated. No vampire king has ever accepted such personal liability, because no vampire king has faced a blood plague threatening thousands of our population, Matthias countered. Unprecedented circumstances warrant unprecedented responses. I am formally granting sanctuary status to Haven Sinclair under my authority as Vampire King. This decision is binding across all vampire courts. Any court challenging this sanctuary automatically challenges my authority. The challenge was clear. Any vampire attempting to harm Haven would be attacking the Vampire King's sovereign decision. The political cost would be catastrophic. The female elder studied Matthias for a long moment. Very well. Sanctuary is accepted, pending your assumption of full liability. But understand that this sets a dangerous precedent. Other humans may soon discover our existence and demand sanctuary protection. You have opened a door that may be impossible to close. I'm aware, Matthias said. But the alternative is allowing vampire population to collapse under blood plague while humans remain ignorant. I accept the consequences of this decision. The council vote was formalized through a series of gestures and formal acknowledgments. Sanctuary status for Haven Sinclair was established. She was now legally protected from vampire assassination. She was also now legally bound to eternal silence. Breaking that silence meant immediate execution, authorized by the Vampire King himself. As the ceremony concluded, and vampires began dispersing, Cassian approached his father. The silver-haired younger vampire's expression was complex, a mixture of admiration and concern, and something darker that Haven couldn't quite identify. You've trapped yourself, Cassian said quietly, speaking only for his father's ears. Yes, Matthias agreed. I've also saved our population from exposure and acquired a blood bank liaison who understands the stakes perfectly. Sanctuary works both directions, Cassian. She is protected, but she is also imprisoned. And I am imprisoned alongside her through my assumption of personal liability. What happens when she resents that imprisonment? Cassian asked. When she realizes she's bound to silence forever? Then I deal with that consequence, Matthias said, as I deal with all consequences born from choices I've made. Haven was escorted from the sanctum by Evelyn. As she moved through the underground passages, she understood what had just occurred. She was no longer in danger of execution. She was no longer facing a choice between death and sanctuary. She was now legally bound. Vampire law made manifest. Protected and imprisoned in equal measure. And Matthias had made himself responsible for maintaining that balance, which meant he could never afford to harm her now. He could never afford to let her suffer in ways that might push her toward betrayal. They were bound together through his extraordinary decision, both of them imprisoned by his choice to save her. Chapter 7. The Price of Protection. The FBI investigation took 11 days to fully conclude. Haven watched from her blood bank station as agents systematically dismantled Regina's embezzlement operation, pulling financial records, interviewing staff, constructing a case that had nothing to do with vampires and everything to do with human greed. Owen kept her informed. He seemed to genuinely respect her initial investigation work, treating her as a professional colleague rather than a potential suspect. He explained how anonymous evidence had been delivered through an encrypted server, detailed financial records showing Regina's black market blood sales stretching back 6 months. The evidence was forensically clean, untraceable, and absolutely damning. Whoever sent this knew exactly what they were doing, Owen said during one of their follow-up meetings in the hospital cafeteria. This isn't amateur work. This is someone with deep access to hospital financial systems and a very clear motivation to expose Regina specifically. Haven nodded, understanding perfectly well that Cassian had orchestrated the evidence delivery. The Vampire Network had provided Owen with exactly what he needed to close the case without ever touching supernatural operations. Regina's arrest occurred on a Thursday morning. Haven watched from her office window as federal agents escorted the hospital administrator out in handcuffs. Regina's face was composed, calculating even in defeat. She'd already begun negotiating her plea deal before the arraignment was scheduled. David's exoneration came 2 days later. The FBI revealed that the badge access records implicating him had been falsified, digital manipulation attributed to Regina's attempts to destroy evidence and misdirect investigation. David received a formal apology from hospital administration. Haven made sure to speak with him personally, though she couldn't explain the full scope of what had actually happened. "I don't understand why she targeted me," David had said, his voice still shaking with residual fear. "I never did anything to her." "You were convenient," Haven had replied, which was true enough without being entirely honest. Wrong place, wrong time, and someone needed a scapegoat. James emerged from the investigation as a cooperative witness rather than a conspirator. He testified that he'd been unaware of Regina's embezzlement scheme, that he'd trusted her financial oversight implicitly. The testimony was carefully constructed, true in its specifics while omitting everything related to vampire operations. Haven learned later, through Evelyn's careful disclosure, that James had been offered sanctuary status. He'd accepted immediately, understanding that his knowledge of Matthias's true nature made him permanently vulnerable without legal protection. James wasn't brave. He was pragmatic. Sanctuary meant survival. Harold received the same offer on a quiet evening when Matthias summoned him to the executive offices. Harold had described the meeting to Haven afterward, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and resignation. "He was honest," Harold had said. "Matthias explained that I knew too much to remain unprotected, that other vampire courts might see me as a liability. Sanctuary wasn't optional, but it also wasn't a threat. It was acknowledgement of reality." "Are you afraid?" Haven had asked. "Constantly," Harold had admitted. "But I'm also alive, and I understand now what you've been carrying. The weight of knowing things you can never speak about." 3 weeks after the FBI closed their investigation, Haven received another summons to Matthias's office. Evening meeting. She'd known this confrontation was inevitable. They'd avoided each other since the council's judgment, Haven returning to her blood bank duties while Matthias remained in his administrative isolation. But the tension between them required resolution. The office looked exactly as it had during their first meeting. Minimal. Cold. Deliberately impersonal. Matthias stood by the window again, silver hair catching the city lights below. When he turned to face her, his expression held something different than before. Not quite guilt, but acknowledgement. "You're angry," Matthias said without preamble. "Yes," Haven replied. She didn't sit down, didn't make herself comfortable. "I'm furious." "Understandable. You forced sanctuary upon me," Haven continued, her voice steady despite the rage building beneath it. "You took away my choice. You bound me to eternal silence without my consent. You did exactly what you promised you wouldn't do. You eliminated my autonomy while pretending to protect me." "Yes," Matthias agreed. "I did all of those things." His immediate acknowledgement destabilized her prepared arguments. Haven had expected deflection, justification, the kind of elaborate rationalization that powerful men deployed when confronted with their abuses. Instead, she found simple admission. The sanctuary law requires consent, Haven pressed. You violated your own legal framework. I invoked extraordinary authority as Vampire King, Matthias corrected. The framework allows for such invocations during circumstances threatening vampire survival. But you're correct that I violated the spirit of the law while technically adhering to its letter. I coerced you through extraordinary means rather than through direct threat. But coercion remains coercion regardless of method. Haven moved closer to his desk, her hands gripping the back of the chair she refused to sit in. Do you understand what you've done to me? I'm trapped. Forever. I can never go to authorities if I'm attacked. I can never warn another human about what exists in the shadows. I can never speak truthfully about my own life to anyone outside your network. You've imprisoned me in silence for eternity, and you did it to protect your own interests. No, Matthias said quietly. I did it to protect you. That's not protection, Haven shot back. That's control disguised as care. Matthias was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried something Haven hadn't heard before. Genuine vulnerability. You're correct. My protective instinct violated your freedom. I feared the council would execute you. I feared that human law enforcement would eventually discover enough evidence to expose vampire operations. I feared that your intelligence and integrity would drive you to choices that would result in your death, so I eliminated your ability to make those choices. He paused, moving away from the window to face her directly. I made a decision born from 615 years of prioritizing survival over morality. I chose to imprison you to save you, and in doing so, I became exactly the kind of authority you've spent your career resisting. The kind that decides what's best for others without their input. Haven felt tears forming, but she refused to let them fall. What happens now? I'm bound. You're personally liable for my compliance. We're trapped together in this arrangement you created. Yes, Matthias acknowledged. I trapped myself as thoroughly as I trapped you. If you violate sanctuary, if you reveal vampire existence, I am authorized to execute you personally. But I also cannot allow you to suffer in ways that might drive you to that violation. Your well-being has become my personal responsibility, not because I care about you specifically, but because I care about my own survival. Your compliance requires that I ensure you have reasons to comply. So you'll control my entire life to make sure I never have motivation to betray you, Haven said bitterly. Or I'll work to make your life bearable despite the constraints I've imposed, Matthias countered. That's the choice I face. And I'm choosing the latter because I genuinely regret the violation. Haven finally sat down, exhausted by the weight of her own fury. This isn't reconciliation. No, Matthias agreed. It's recognition. We're bound together through my extraordinary decision. Neither of us chose this arrangement freely. Neither of us can escape it. We can either make that binding unbearable or find ways to coexist within its constraints. I hate you, Haven said, though the words lacked conviction. You have that right, Matthias replied. But hatred requires energy. Eventually, you'll transition to something more sustainable. Resentment, perhaps. Or pragmatic acceptance. Or, if I manage this correctly, mutual respect born from understanding that we're both prisoners of circumstances neither of us fully controls. Haven looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since the council meeting. He appeared tired in ways that transcended physical exhaustion. 600 years of making impossible choices had carved something permanent into his features. He wasn't cruel. He was simply ancient and desperate, and willing to sacrifice individual freedom for collective survival. What happens next? Haven asked. Regina is convicted. David moves forward with his life. The hospital continues functioning. You continue working in the blood bank, but now as an official liaison to vampire operations. You'll receive compensation for that work. You'll have access to resources that might eventually help research solutions to the blood plague. You'll live within the constraints of sanctuary while I work to make those constraints as bearable as possible. And if I can't bear them, then we both face the consequences, Matthias said simply, because I've made your survival essential to mine. They sat in silence for several minutes, neither speaking, both understanding that this conversation had shifted something fundamental in their relationship. They would never be allies. They would never be friends. but they'd acknowledged the reality of their binding. Two people trapped together by a decision one of them made in desperation. When Haven finally left his office, she understood that her life had been permanently altered. The freedom she'd once taken for granted was gone, but she was alive. And in the space between imprisonment and survival, she would find whatever meaning remained available to her. The sanctuary law had saved her life while destroying her autonomy, and Matthias would spend the rest of his immortal existence ensuring she never regretted survival enough to choose betrayal. Chapter 8. Where Silence Becomes Home. The blood bank looked exactly the same as it had before everything changed. The refrigeration units maintained their steady hum. The inventory system processed requisitions with mechanical precision. The fluorescent lights cast everything in the same institutional white that had defined Haven's workspace for 9 years. But nothing was actually the same anymore. 3 months had passed since Regina's conviction. The hospital had settled into a new normal, tighter financial oversight, increased administrative scrutiny, the kind of procedural reforms that followed any major scandal. Haven's official title had been expanded to include Blood Bank Liaison to Administrative Oversight. Her salary had increased by 18%. The promotion had been announced publicly, attributed to her exceptional work during the investigation into embezzlement. What the hospital didn't know was that her real work had fundamentally transformed. Cassian had delivered the first research materials in a sealed box deposited in Haven's apartment on a Thursday evening. Vampire medical texts dating back centuries, studies on blood plague viral structure, hypothetical treatment protocols developed by vampire researchers working in the shadows of human medical advancement. The materials were staggering in their depth, millennia of accumulated knowledge about a condition humans would never discover because it only affected the undead. Haven had spent her evenings reviewing everything, cross-referencing with human medical literature, identifying intersections between vampire physiology and treatment possibilities that human science might not have considered. She'd created a research database on an encrypted drive that Cassian had provided. She'd begun to understand the blood plague not as abstract vampire crisis, but as a medical problem requiring methodical analysis. Matthias had visited her apartment once to review her initial findings. He'd stood in her living room surrounded by scattered research materials, studying her notes with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting centuries for this particular solution. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something Haven hadn't heard from him before. "Hope, you're approaching this differently than our researchers," he'd said, pointing to her analysis of human immunological responses. They focused on vampire physiology. You're analyzing the intersection between blood composition and viral mutation patterns. It's the same approach I'd use in the blood bank, Haven had replied. Looking for variables that make blood suitable for specific situations. In this case, the situation is viral resistance. It might work, Matthias had said quietly. Your sister's death taught you to think about blood in ways our people have forgotten. Clinical precision rather than cultural tradition. Haven had wanted to respond with anger, to reject his suggestion that Eleanor's death could serve any purpose beyond loss. But she'd remained silent, understanding that grief transformed into purpose was the only way she could survive her imprisonment. The research had accelerated over the following weeks. Cassian brought additional materials. Harold, recognizing Haven's quiet desperation, had offered to help with the medical analysis. His decades of clinical experience providing perspective, Haven sometimes lacked. James had secured access to advanced laboratory equipment through legitimate hospital channels, claiming it was for routine blood bank analysis. Together, they'd begun the work of developing a treatment protocol that human medicine could ostensibly discover independently, while actually drawing on vampire knowledge that predated human civilization. 4 months into the research, results began emerging. A combination of antiviral compounds with specific blood component modifications showed promise in vampire test subjects. The treatment didn't cure the blood plague, but it stabilized the condition. It prevented deterioration. It transformed a lethal infection into a manageable chronic condition. The vampire network had begun implementing the treatment across regional populations. Blood thefts from the hospital had gradually diminished as the desperate need for emergency supplies decreased. The crisis was resolving not through continued theft, but through actual medical advancement. Owen had called Haven once to check in. The investigation had been officially closed. He'd expressed vague frustration about inconsistencies in the case, pieces that didn't quite fit, questions that remained unanswered. But he'd also accepted that sometimes investigations concluded without perfect clarity. "You did good work," he'd told her. "Just want you to know that. Your investigation probably prevented this situation from escalating further." She'd thanked him, unable to tell him that his investigation had barely scratched the surface of what was actually occurring within the hospital's walls. Cassian's distrust of Haven had evolved into something approaching grudging respect. He'd realized, watching her work with Matthias and the Vampire Research Network, that she wasn't a liability waiting to be managed. She was an asset actively contributing to vampire survival. His skepticism hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more professional. He still didn't trust her entirely, but he respected her competence. Harold had eventually reached out to understand the full scope of what was happening. Matthias had explained everything: the sanctuary binding, the research, the gradual resolution of the blood plague crisis. Harold had accepted the reality with the weary resignation of someone too old to be surprised by anything anymore. "How long?" Harold had asked. "How long do you think until the plague is fully contained?" 2 years, perhaps 3, Matthias had replied. "Once the treatment is widespread, once human medicine independently discovers similar protocols, once the crisis becomes manageable rather than existential, the blood thefts can stop entirely." "And then what?" Harold had asked. "What happens to Haven then?" "She remains bound by sanctuary law," Matthias had said. "She remains my responsibility. She remains trapped in silence. But she'll have chosen to help save thousands of lives. That choice will sustain her more effectively than any forced protection ever could." Harold had seemed to accept this, understanding that some forms of imprisonment could be willingly inhabited if they served a larger purpose. The final arrangement had been established 3 months into Haven's research. Matthias had formalized her compensation through hospital administration: a consulting fee for special projects supporting blood bank operations and administrative efficiency, $15,000 monthly, deposited directly to her account. No questions asked, no documentation required. Haven had used a portion of the money to create a foundation in Eleanor's name, a nonprofit supporting blood bank research and transfusion services development. She'd funded scholarships for students pursuing blood bank specialization. She'd established grants for research into rare blood conditions. She'd transformed her sister's death into institutional memory, creating legacy that persisted regardless of her own constraints. The sanctuary law's binding had become almost invisible over time. Haven rarely thought about it consciously anymore. It was simply the context within which her life functioned. She couldn't speak about vampires to anyone outside the network. She couldn't warn potential human targets. She couldn't go to authorities if threatened. But she also had access to resources that allowed her to do meaningful work. She had purpose that extended beyond her own survival. She'd learned through months of captivity and subsequent freedom that imprisonment could be bearable when one chose to make it meaningful. Tonight, the late shift stretched ahead of her. Blood bank processing, inventory verification, the routine work that defined her professional existence. The elevator descended around 11 p.m., though no one had used it in hours. Haven heard the soft mechanical sound, the subtle shift in air pressure that preceded the opening of the private entrance. Matthias emerged wearing an expensive suit that didn't quite look like a suit anymore. It looked like clothing worn by someone who'd forgotten how to appear human. His silver hair caught the fluorescent light. His pale skin seemed to absorb rather than reflect illumination. He moved through the blood bank with the casual ownership of someone for whom concepts like permission had become entirely abstract. "The research is progressing adequately?" he asked, his voice carrying across the quiet space. "Better than adequately," Haven replied. "The next phase of trials begins next week." "Good," Matthias said. He stood at the blood inventory refrigerator, observing the units with detached assessment. "In another year, perhaps 18 months, we'll have sufficient treatment protocols distributed that blood thefts become unnecessary." "And then?" Haven asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then nothing changes," Matthias said. "You remain bound by sanctuary. I remain responsible for your compliance. But the binding will feel different once you understand that we've saved thousands of lives through your cooperation." Haven didn't respond immediately. She understood that he was offering her something difficult. Not forgiveness, not liberation, but the understanding that her imprisonment had generated meaning, that her silence had enabled survival, that her bound existence had prevented countless deaths. It wasn't reconciliation. It would never be reconciliation. They would never be friends or allies or anything resembling equals. But they were bound together by a decision made in desperation, and that binding had transformed into something neither of them had entirely anticipated. "I'm still angry," Haven said quietly. "I know," Matthias replied. "You may remain angry forever, but anger alongside purpose is sustainable in ways that anger alone never is." He turned to leave, pausing at the private elevator entrance. "Thank you for the research, for the effort, for understanding that sometimes survival requires sacrifice." After he left, Haven returned to her inventory checks. The blood bank hummed around her. The refrigeration units maintained their steady temperature. The sanctuary law held her in silent protection, binding her to a future she'd never chosen but had slowly learned to inhabit. She would spend the rest of her life in this space, between human and vampire worlds, unable to fully belong to either. She would research blood plague treatment and manage hospital inventory. She would carry Eleanor's memory forward through foundation work and quiet persistence. She would live within constraints she'd never accepted, transforming them into meaning through deliberate choice. The blood bank remained exactly as it had always been. But Haven had learned that sometimes the most profound changes occurred not in external circumstances, but in the way one chose to understand captivity. She worked through the night, documenting blood units, verifying inventory, maintaining the careful records that no one except Matthias and his network understood represented far more than simple hospital administration. In the sanctuary of silence, she had finally found something approaching peace.